The earth it is Jehovah's, and the plenteousness of it, the habitable world, and they that in the same do sit. For he upon the watery seas hath founded it secure, and on the flowing rivers hath the same established shore.
This is the 24th Psalm as it was sung by the Pilgrims. The melody was probably traditional, but the verse translation was made by Henry Ainsworth, a great English scholar of Hebrew who was born just 4 centuries ago. He was driven to Holland from England about 1593 because he refused to conform with the Church of England as it was regulated under Queen Elizabeth I. He was what was called a separatist, and he lived in Amsterdam. The Pilgrims also refused to conform, and they fled to Holland about 1607, first to Amsterdam, and then to the university city of Leiden. There they were free to worship as they pleased. Religion alone prompted the Pilgrims' journeys far from home. Religion alone held them together. Religion alone brought them to America. But it was their very special kind of religion which set them apart. Not content with the form of Protestantism re-established by the bishops and clergy in the England of Queen Elizabeth I, the Pilgrim movement was a protest against the Protestants themselves. It was a movement to abolish what they called base and beggarly ceremonies, along with the bishops and clergy who performed them. This, then, is the saga of the Pilgrims, who in the beginning were called separatists because they wanted complete separation from the established church. Their movement did not start in London or in one of the universities, but in a triangle of countryside in northern Nottinghamshire between the counties of York and Lincoln. The 3 points of the triangle were Austerfield, next to Bawtry, Yorkshire, at the top, and Worksop and Babworth, both in Nottinghamshire, at the base. This triangle was the birthplace of the Pilgrim movement. Here, as it was explained by William Bradford, the ablest leader in the movement,
Master Richard Clifton, a grave and reverend preacher, who by his pains and diligence had done much good, and under God had been a means of the conversion of many. Also Master William Brewster, a reverend man, who afterwards was chosen an elder of the church, and lived with them till old age.
Clifton was responsible for Bradford's own conversion to separatism, while Brewster, a layman, not only contributed financially to the new church, but by 1601 or so, practically adopted young Bradford. Even before then, however, various religious groups had sprung up in England outside the Anglican Church, and one of these, called the Ancient Church, fled to Holland, where there was religious freedom. There the Reverend Henry Ainsworth joined the group, as we know, and in 1596 he published a small book enumerating the articles of faith on which they agreed. They obeyed the Queen, they said, in civil matters, but not in those which had to do with religion. Among other things, Ainsworth wrote,
"We are but strangers and pilgrims, warring against many and mighty adversaries."
This was the first time that the separatists are known to have called themselves pilgrims. 7 years later, Queen Elizabeth died, and the dissident religious groups began to hope that their new ruler, James I, from Presbyterian Scotland, would lend a more sympathetic ear to their pleas for liberty of worship. They were soon disappointed, especially the separatists at Scrooby, began to be harassed by the king's officers, indeed, in such fashion that, as Bradford wrote,
their former afflictions were but as flea-bitings in comparison of these which now came upon them. For some were taken and clapped up in prison. Others had their houses beset and watched, day and night, and hardly escaped their hands. And the most were fain to flee and leave their houses and habitations, and the means of their livelihood. So after they had continued together about a year, seeing they could no longer continue in that condition, they resolved to get over into Holland as they could.
This they managed to do in small parties, and there
they saw many goodly and fortified cities. Also they heard a strange and uncouth language, and beheld the different manners and customs of the people with their strange fashions and attires, all so far differing from that of their plain country villages as it seemed they were come into a new world.
It did not occur to the separatists that their manners and dress seemed odd not only to the Dutch, but even to their fellow Englishmen. Their doublets and breeches and hose were grey and unostentatious in a flamboyant age. In time they learned trades and managed to support themselves, but they were not happy, mostly because another separatist English church there made trouble for them. They accordingly decided to move to Leiden, some 30 miles away, where life again was mostly hard work, even for Bradford, who came of age in 1611 and converted his estate in England into money for use in Holland. But in Leiden, the Pilgrims still found the Dutch too tolerant. Yea, said Bradford,
some preferred and chose the prisons in England rather than this liberty in Holland, with these afflictions,
such as the Dutch desecrating the Sabbath by feasting and merrymaking. As a matter of fact,
it was thought that if a better and easier place of living could be had, it would draw many and take away these discouragements. And the place they had thoughts on as an abode was some of those vast and unpeopled countries of America, which are fruitful and fit for human habitation.
After much discussion, including the matter of who was going to finance such a voyage, it was pointed out
that all great and honorable actions are accompanied with great difficulties, and must be enterprised and overcome with answerable courages. It was granted. The dangers were great, but not desperate. The difficulties were many, but not invincible.
In the end, after suitable prayers to the Almighty, a general conference got around to the question of where they might settle. Guyana was suggested, then Virginia, which in those days meant the coast of America from North Carolina to New York. Objections were raised to both, but
at length the conclusion was to live as a distinct body by themselves under the general government of Virginia, and by their friends to sue to his Majesty that he would be pleased to grant them freedom of religion. Whereupon 2 were chosen and sent into England, at the charge of the rest, to solicit this matter, who found the Virginia Company very desirous to have them go thither, and willing to grant them a patent with an ample privileges as they had, or could grant to any, and to give them the best furtherance they could.
But the patent was easier proposed than obtained. The religious issue cropped up, and with it endless financial problems, in addition to the question of just where they might settle. In the end, it was decided, for good or for ill, and it proved to be the latter, that the group would accept an outsider to help with freighting their ship or ships.
His name was Master Martin. He came from Billericay in Essex, from which parts came sundry others to go with them, as also from London and other places. And therefore it was thought meet and convenient by them in Holland that these strangers that were to go with them should appoint one thus to be joined with them to avoid all suspicion of any partiality.
For the first time, the name strangers was applied to the persons who had to be taken along to please the adventurers who financed the voyage. The separatists called themselves saints. Then the matter of where they might settle was determined by the patent they obtained from the Virginia Company. This authorized them to establish themselves anywhere south of the 41st parallel north latitude. To avoid control by the Jamestown colony, they steered for New York Bay, as it is now called. Bradford at last could write,
After much travel and these debates, all things were got ready and provided. A small ship was bought and fitted in Holland to help transport them and to stay in the country when they came there. Another was hired at London of about 180 tons burden, and all other things got in readiness. So, being ready to depart, they had a day of solemn humiliation.
Then they sorrowfully trudged, men, women, and children, 24 miles to the port of Delfshaven by Rotterdam, where their ship lay ready for them. Thus,
they left that goodly and pleasant city which had been their resting place near 12 years. But they knew they were pilgrims, and looked not much on those things.
Bradford himself noted that the word pilgrims was taken from the Epistle of St. Paul to the Hebrews, and it may be that the pilgrim flock had already begun to use that name for themselves, but it was years before it appeared in print in that sense. In any case, we can now call them pilgrims. The next day, those who were to sail away boarded the ship, and since the wind was fair,
they took their leaves one of another, which proved to be the last leave to many of them. Thus, hoisting sail about the 22nd of July, with a prosperous wind, they came in short time to Southampton, where they found the bigger ship come from London, lying ready with all the rest of their company.
The year was 1620. It was 13 years since William Brewster had resigned his post in Scrooby to help the Pilgrims flee to Holland. During those years, the Jamestown colony had gained a foothold which no power was by then prepared to challenge. Captain John Smith had long since left Jamestown and had visited New England and drawn a map of it. Hearing of the Pilgrims' desire to go to America, he offered his services as a guide, but, as he wrote, their
ignorance caused them for more than a year to endure a wonderful deal of misery with an infinite patience, saying my books and maps were much better cheap to teach them than myself. Many others have used the like good husbandry, that have paid soundly in trying their self-willed conclusions.
It is probable that the Pilgrims knew Smith's reputation as a self-willed man, and they had enough of those around already. They preferred the saintly admonitions of their pastor, John Robinson. However it was, they set sail from Southampton, as Bradford wrote,
about the 5th of August. But they had not gone far, but Master Reynolds, master of the lesser ship, complained that he found his ship so leaky that he durst not put further to sea till she was mended.
They put back into Dartmouth, and then Plymouth, for further repairs. In vain. The smaller ship was still not seaworthy, so they decided to give it up, along with some of the passengers, and send it back to London. And at last the larger ship, the Mayflower, sailed alone. As an anonymous author wrote in a book commonly called Mort's Relation,
Wednesday, the 6th of September, 1620, the wind coming east-northeast, a fine gale, we loosed from Plymouth, having been kindly entertained and courteously used by divers friends there dwelling. And after many difficulties and boisterous storms, at length, by God's providence, upon the 9th of November following, by break of day, we espied land, which we deemed to be Cape Cod, and so afterward it proved.
Cape Cod had been so named 18 years before by Captain Bartholomew Gosnold, but it was outside the territory where they had authority to settle. Therefore, as Bradford explained,
after some deliberation had amongst themselves, and with the master of the ship, they tacked about and resolved to stand for the southward, and the wind and weather being fair, to find some place about Hudson's River for their habitation. But after they had sailed that course about half a day, they fell amongst dangerous shoals and roaring breakers, and the wind shrinking upon them withal, they resolved to bear up again for the Cape, and thought themselves happy to get out of those dangers before night overtook them, as by God's good providence they did. And the next day they got into the Cape Harbor, where they rid in safety.
By then it was the 11th of November. The Pilgrims were not where they had planned to be, but in that bitter cold the leaders of the group decided that it was too late in the season to sail on in the face of uncharted shoals and fitful winds. The Cape Harbor, however, was outside the area where they were licensed to settle. Therefore, the leaders called on the colonists to assemble voluntarily to acknowledge the king, so as not to be outside the law too, and to establish a governing body for themselves by means of an agreement, or compact, as Bradford put it, to
combine together in one body, and submit to such government and governors as we should, by common consent, agree to make and choose. And we set our hands to this.
A little more than a year before, the colonists in Virginia had obtained from the king a commission permitting them to assemble for the purpose of governing themselves. The Mayflower Compact differed in that it originated on shipboard, and it was designed to establish a civil government among the Pilgrims themselves. Yet they were alike in that they were the first instances of European colonists living in the New World under the rule of laws, at least in part, set up for themselves. This first foundation of the Pilgrim government, as Bradford called it, was
occasioned partly by the discontented and mutinous speeches that some of the strangers amongst them had let fall from them in the ship.
It was signed by only 41 male colonists out of a total of 103 or 4 men, women, and children, but the majority of more than 60 did not object. Neither the women or children could sign, and more than a dozen servants and seamen did not. Even if the government established by the compact was far from democratic in the modern sense, it was a step in that direction. Various statutes were enacted by the freemen of the colony, along with the right to trial by jury, whether or not these statutes were or are considered as a code of laws. And punishment for crimes and misdemeanors were imposed, in accordance with the common law of England, by the governor of the colony and his assistants, generally with less severity than in the mother country. Usually it was a matter of fines or sentences to the stocks or the whipping post. As soon then as the compact provided the necessary basis for civil administration, the Pilgrims, as Mort's relation says,
set ashore 15 or 16 men, well armed, to see what the land was like, and what inhabitants they could meet with.
These explorers found themselves on a small neck of land, but saw no Indian and no sign of any habitation. The next day, a Sunday, was observed as the Sabbath of the Old Testament, with total rest from trouble, labor, and even travel. But on Monday, all went to work with a will.
We unshipped our shallop, and drew her on land to mend and repair her, which kept us long there, for it was 16 or 17 days before the carpenter had finished her.
By then the Pilgrims got impatient. They wanted to see the place. So within a couple of days, 16 men were again put ashore, fully armed, under the military command of Captain Miles Standish. Standish was a younger edition of Captain John Smith by some 4 years, perhaps somewhat shorter in stature, and certainly shorter in patience. William Bradford went with this detachment, and he wrote,
When they had marched about the space of a mile by the seaside, they espied 5 or 6 persons with a dog coming towards them, who were savages. But they fled from them and ran up into the woods, and the English followed them. But the Indians, seeing themselves thus followed, ran away on the sands, so as they could not come near them. So the night coming on,
They camped, and the next morning they tried to follow the Indians, but lost both the Indians and themselves.
but at length they found water and refreshed themselves, being the first New England water they drank of, and was now, in great thirst, as pleasant unto them as wine or beer had been in foretimes.
The rest of the month of November was spent in petty exploring. But what they both longed and feared to see, some 5 Indians, was not yet granted them. And it was only early on Friday, December the 8th, that another exploring party at last encountered any native occupants of Cape Cod. Bradford, who was along, described it.
The cry of our enemies was dreadful. Woe! Woe! Hey! Hey! Ha! Woe! Our men were no sooner come to their arms, but the enemy were ready to assault them. There was a lusty man who was thought to be their captain. He stood behind a tree, and there let his arrows fly, which were all avoided. He stood 3 shots of a musket, till one, taking full aim at him, made the bark of the tree fly about his ears, after which he gave an extraordinary shriek, and away they went, all of them.
That same afternoon they began more seriously to look for a harbor where they could establish their settlement, and after many vicissitudes they finally reached Plymouth, so named by Captain John Smith, and disembarked on Clark's Island, named for Master's mate John Clark, who found it in the dark, the rain, and the wind. The next day was Sunday, so they did nothing. But in the morning of December 11, 1620, they explored and sounded the harbor, and finally landed somewhere near the modern site of Plymouth Rock. There were 10 pilgrims in the shallop which made this truly historic excursion, including the first governor, John Carver, William Bradford, Edward Winslow, and Captain Miles Standish. In addition, there were 2 seamen hired by the Pilgrims and 3 sailors. Having found the place very good for situation, as Winslow put it, the party returned to Cape Cod and the Mayflower. 4 days later, the anchor was weighed, and the entire company sailed for Plymouth. A contrary wind almost blew them back to the Cape, but at last, on Saturday the 16th, they got the ship through the tricky entrance to the harbor and safely anchored off the site of modern Plymouth. Then they prepared to keep the Sabbath. The next day, Mort's relation says,
Monday, the 18th, we went to land, manned with the master of the ship, Captain Christopher Jones, and 3 or 4 of the sailors. We marched along the coast in the woods, but saw not an Indian, nor an Indian house. Only we found where formerly had been some inhabitants, and where they had planted their corn.
The Indian village that had existed there had been wiped out by some sort of pestilence 3 or 4 years before, the Pilgrims later learned. For the moment, they merely observed everything carefully and returned to the ship for the night. But beginning the next morning, the able-bodied members of the community set to work to establish their colony. Bradford noted that
All this while, the Indians came skulking about them, and would sometimes show themselves far off. But when they approached near them, they would run away. And once they stole away their tools where they had been at work and were gone to dinner.
a natural result of this was that Miles Standish was chosen Captain General, so to say, and given authority of command, as it was expressed. But, as it happened in Jamestown, death began to take its toll in Plymouth, so that in 2 or 3 months' time, half of the colony died, mostly of cold and malnutrition. Few escaped sickness entirely. Bradford himself was taken ill on January 11th, but in time recovered. And at last March came, and with it birds and better weather. Friday the 16th was even fair and warm, And that very morning, a lone Indian presented himself at Plymouth and strode through the houses they had built right to the place where the Pilgrims had met to discuss plans for their defense. Mort's relation describes it.
He saluted us in English and bade us welcome, for he had learned some broken English amongst the Englishmen that came to fish at Monhegan Island. He was a man free in speech, so far as he could express his mind, and of a seemly carriage. We questioned him of many things. He was the first savage we could meet withal.
The Indian, Samoset by name, was from Maine, and had been on an English explorer's ship which brought him to the Cape Cod region not many months before, where he had remained ever since. He asked for some beer, but they gave him strong water, better known as firewater, and something to eat. Then
he told us the place where we now live is called Patuxet, and that about 4 years ago all the inhabitants died of an extraordinary plague, and there is neither man, nor woman, nor child remaining, as indeed we have found none, so as there is none to hinder our possession or to lay claim unto it.
this information was valuable, and after some hesitation the Pilgrims allowed Samoset to spend the night with them. The next day, a Saturday, Samoset left, but returned Sunday with 5 other tall Indians. They were told to leave their bows and arrows a quarter of a mile from the settlement, which they did, and then were hospitably received with food and drink. Then the Indians performed for their hosts, dancing and singing like circus clowns, after which they wanted to barter furs for tools and trinkets. The Pilgrims' feelings about such matters on the Sabbath may be imagined. The Indians were courteously but firmly dismissed.
We gave every one of them some trifles and escorted them to the place where they left their bows and arrows, whereat they were amazed. 2 of them began to slink away, but the others called them, and so, with many thanks given us, they departed.
After finally getting rid of Samoset and having a brief encounter with some other Indians, on Wednesday all of the Pilgrims were finally brought ashore from the Mayflower. But the next day Samoset was back, now accompanied by Squanto, the only surviving native of Patuxet, renamed Plymouth. These 2 told the Pilgrims that the great sachem Massasoit was there, accompanied by his brother and some 60 braves. The Pilgrims
were not willing to send our Governor Carver to them, and they were unwilling to come to us. So Squanto went again to them, and brought word that we should send one to parley, to know the sachem's mind, and to signify the mind and will of our governor, which was to have peace and trading with him.
After an exchange of speeches and hostages, Massasoit agreed to visit Plymouth, where a peace treaty was negotiated. Its terms were honorable, and it was faithfully kept until Massasoit's death 40 years later. Meanwhile, Squanto began teaching the Pilgrims how to plant corn and catch fish in the brook, and so on. On April the 5th, the Mayflower sailed back to England, never to return. Another ship would come before the end of the year, however, and bring a few more saints, as the Pilgrims called their group. In mid-April, Governor Carver died from sunstroke while planting corn, and William Bradford was soon elected to his place. Bradford was to be the colony's leader, in fact, if not always in title, for the rest of his life. Abetted by the special talents of Squanto during a year and a half, he brought Plymouth through the very trying period of developing a close-knit village which could grow such things as corn and beans, trade in such things as fish and furs, and get along with the Indians. Peace with them was at least temporarily achieved by late September, even with tribes as far away as Boston. And on December the 11th, Edward Winslow, an active young pilgrim from Leiden, was able to write to a friend in England about the Feast of Thanksgiving they arranged. After the spring planting, he wrote,
Our corn did prove well, and, God be praised, we had a good increase of Indian corn, but our barley indifferent, and our peas not worth the gathering. Still, our harvest being gotten in, our governor sent 4 men on fowling, that so we might, after more special manner, rejoice together. They 4, in one day, killed as much fowl as, with a little help besides, served the company almost a week, at which time, amongst other recreations, we exercised our arms, many of the Indians coming amongst us, and amongst the rest, their greatest king, Massasoit, with some 90 men, whom for 3 days we entertained and feasted, and they went out and killed 5 deer, which they brought to our plantation and bestowed on our governor and upon the captain and others.
Governor Bradford did not bother to mention this first Thanksgiving in New England, though he did refer to many pilgrims who afterwards sent letters to friends in England telling of their plenty in Plymouth.
Which were not feigned, but true reports. In November, about that time 12-month that themselves came, there came in a small ship to them, unexpected or looked for, in which came Master Cushman.
Robert Cushman was the pilgrim deacon and agent in London, without whose assistance the Mayflower could hardly have sailed in the first place.
With him came 35 persons to remain and live in the plantation, which did not a little rejoice them. And they, when they came ashore and found all well and saw plenty of victuals in every house, were no less glad, for most of them were lusty young men, and many of them wild enough, who little considered whither or about what they went, till they came into the harbour at Cape Cod, and there saw nothing but a naked and barren place.
Only a dozen of the 35 seemed to have been pilgrims, and the ship brought peremptory demands on the pilgrims as well. Those who had financed the Mayflower were furious that ship had returned from New England without any profitable freight at all. Deacon Cushman had to deliver an energetic sermon on the sin and danger of self-love to convince the pilgrims that some sort of tangible benefit would have to be sent by the same ship on its return voyage. Bradford replied with a letter of explanation, which was shrewdly accompanied by furs and good clabbered, valued by Bradford at nearly 500 pounds sterling. Then, not long after, 2 disconcerting events happened. A passing ship told Plymouth of the Virginia massacre of March 1622, which cost the lives of about 1/4 of the colony, and Squanto, their Indian tutor, died of a fever. Both were bad news so far as Plymouth's relations with the Indians were concerned. That same year, John Alden married Priscilla Mullins, a wedding more notable in Longfellow's poetry than in the history of the times. Then the following spring, their policy of common work in the fields, modeled after that in Virginia, was abandoned, and each family was assigned a parcel of land, and all boys and otherwise unattached youths were assigned to some family which, as Bradford wrote,
made all hands very industrious. The women now went willingly into the field and took their little ones with them to set corn, whom to have compelled would have been thought great tyranny and oppression.
For women had no voice in the government of the colony, as we have said. Bradford emphasized the point.
Touching our government, you are quite mistaken if you think we admit women to have to do in the same, for they are excluded, as both reason and nature teacheth they should be.
At the same time, Bradford saw that a number of his associates were right in wanting to set up trading posts to help solve their continuing financial problems, and the idea, quickly approved, soon brought the Pilgrims some independence. This measure of autonomy began about 1627, the same year that a Dutch trader from Manhattan visited Plymouth and introduced the medium of exchange known as wampum. As Bradford put it,
that which turned most to their profit in time was an entrance into the trade of wampum pig, for they now bought about £50 worth of it with them, and they told them how vendible it was at their fort at Albany, and did persuade them they would find it so at Kennebec. And so it came to pass in time till the inland people knew of it, and afterwards they could scarce ever get enough of them.
The Dutch trader from Manhattan, Isaac de Rassière, at the same time made notes on Plymouth in October 1627.
The houses are constructed of hewn planks, with gardens also enclosed behind, and at the sides with hewn planks, so that the houses and courtyards are arranged in very good order, with a stockade against a sudden attack. And at the end of the streets there are 3 wooden gates. In the centre on the cross street stands the governor's house, before which is a square enclosure, upon which 4 small pieces of ordnance called pedreros are mounted, so as to enfilade the streets. The farms are not as good as ours, because they are more stony, but they have better means of living, because they have the fish so abundant before their doors.
With all of this activity, it was clear that the Pilgrims no longer lived in isolation. Indeed, 2 years before the arrival of the Dutchman, an English captain had turned up in Massachusetts Bay with colonists, servants, supplies, and all, and, as Bradford tells the story,
pitched themselves in a place they called after their captain's name, Mount Wollaston, amongst whom was one Master Thomas Morton. Having continued there some time, and not finding things to answer their expectations, nor profit to arise as they looked for, Captain Wollaston takes a great part of the servants to Virginia, where he puts them off at good rates, selling their time to other men, and writes back to one of his partners to bring another part of them to Virginia. But this Morton, above said, having more craft than honesty, in the other's absence watches an opportunity, and got some drink and other junkets, and made them a feast. And after they were merry, he began to tell them he would give them good counsel. You see, saith he, you will also be carried away and sold for slaves with the rest. But I, having a part in the plantation, will receive you as my partners and consociates. So may you be free, and we will converse, plant and trade, and live together as equals, and support and protect one another, or to the like effect. This counsel was easily received, so after this they fell to great licentiousness, and led a dissolute life, and Morton became lord of misrule. And after they got much by trading with the Indians, they spent it vainly in quaffing and drinking, both wine and strong waters in great excess. They also set up a maypole, drinking and dancing about it many days together, inviting the Indian women for their consorts, dancing and frisking together like so many furies, and worse practices. Morton, likewise, to show his poetry, composed sundry rhymes and verses.
Drink and be merry, merry, merry boys. Let all your delight be in the Hyman's joys. I-ho to Hyman, now the day is coom. About the maypole take a room. Make green garlands, bring bottles out, and fill sweet nectar freely about. And cover thy head and fear no harm, for here's good liquor to keep it warm. Drink and be merry, merry, merry boys. Drink and be merry, merry, merry boys.
They changed also the name of their place, and they called it Merry Mount, as if this jollity would have lasted over. Now, to maintain this riotous prodigality and profuse excess, Morton, thinking himself lawless, and hearing what gain the French and the fishermen made by trading of guns, powder, and shot to the Indians, he, as the head of this consortship, began the practice of the same in these parts. And first he taught them how to use them, to charge and discharge, and what proportion of powder to give the gun, according to the size of the same, and what shot to use for fowl, and what for deer. And having thus instructed them, he employed some of them to hunt and fowl for him, so as they became far more active in that employment than any of the English. So that the Indians are full of guns all over, both fowling pieces, muskets, pistols, and so on. Oh, the horribleness of this villainy! How many both Dutch and English have lately been slain by those Indians thus furnished.
Morton went so far then as to send for more guns from England, and meanwhile would harbour any servant who wanted to run away from his master. It began to look as if this wicked and debased crew, as Bradford termed them, would be more dangerous to the settlements than the Indians themselves. So the principal little plantations, which numbered half a dozen or so, asked Plymouth, the strongest, to join them, in Bradford's words, to
suppress Morton and his consorts before they grew to further head and strength. So they first resolved jointly to write to him, and in friendly and neighbourly way to admonish him to forbear those courses. But he was so high as he scorned all advice, with many scurrilous terms full of disdain. They then sent to him a second time, but he answered in high terms as before, upon which they saw there was no way but to take him by force, and obtained of the governor of Plymouth to send Captain Standish and some other aid with him, the which was accordingly done. But they found him to stand stiffly in his defence, having made fast his doors, armed his consorts, and set powder and bullets ready on the table.
According to Bradford, Morton and his crew were so overarmed with drink that they could not fight and were soon overpowered. Morton was brought to Plymouth, and when a ship sailed for England, he was put aboard. There, however, he told his side of the story and got off scot-free. In fact, he was back in Plymouth less than a year after the Merrymount affair. This is how he told it later, referring to Miles Standish as Captain Shrimp, due to his stature, his red hair, and the color of his face when he was angry.
Now, Captain Shrimp, the first captain in the land, as he supposed, takes 8 persons more to him, and they embark with preparation against Merrymount, where this monster of a man, as their phrase was, had his den. The whole number, being but 7, would have given Captain Shrimp, a quondam drummer, such a welcome as would have made him wish for a drum as big as Diogenes' tub, that he might have crept into it out of sight. But mine host,
Morton is referring to himself,
to save the effusion of much worthy blood, was content to yield upon quarter, which was agreed upon should be performed. But mine host no sooner had set open the door and issued out, but instantly Captain Shrimp and the rest of the worthies stepped to him, laid hold of his arms, and had him down, and so eagerly that they fell upon him as if they would have eaten him, until an old soldier sharply rebuked these worthies for their unworthy practices. So Captain Shrimp and the 9 worthies made themselves master of mine host of Merrymount.
But in the end it was not the Pilgrims who tamed the jolly men of Merrymount, but the Puritans, who had just arrived in Massachusetts. As Bradford continued the story,
shortly after Morton was sent for England, there came over that worthy gentleman, Master John Endicott, who brought over a patent under the broad seal for the government of Massachusetts, who, visiting those parts, caused that maypole to be cut down, and rebuked them for their profaneness, and admonished them to look there should be better walking.
a quaint way of saying that they should behave better. But, oddly perhaps, it is with the reference to John Endicott that Bradford first mentions the beginning of the settlement of Massachusetts Bay and Colony. No longer would Plymouth be a unique experiment carried on in a virtual vacuum. Additional English colonists were arriving by the score. Puritans who were leaving England also on religious grounds in the wake of the accession of Charles I as king, and because of the anti-Puritan leanings of both the king and his most dedicated bishop, William Laud. Though they were not separatists in the same sense as the Pilgrims, the Puritans were soldiers of Christ without fear and without doubts. Their aim was to put straight what was devious, in high places as well as low, and if a new civic order could not be raised in England, it could be on New England's rock-bound shores. An anonymous poet, perhaps Edward Johnson, summed up the result in a small book called Good News from New England, where he tells how the English arrived at Massachusetts Bay, with hearts revived, eyeing new land and trees, but soon were taken sick, and many died, until at last they recovered their strength.
Which once attained, they searched the land, tracing the country over, to raising towns and churches new in wilderness they wander. First Plymouth, and then Salem next, were placed far asunder. Poor cottages them populate with winter's wet soon split. Brave Boston such beginning had, Dorchester so began, Hartford, New Haven, Scituate, Sandwich and Dover all, Southampton, Martha's Vineyard, and some new named towns beside, all by this brood of travellers were peopled far and wide.
The first chapter of the saga of the Pilgrims was closed. The great Puritan migration to Massachusetts had begun, and by the time Bradford made the last entry in his story of Plymouth Plantation, Plymouth was already sinking into relative obscurity. At last, in 1691, King James's great-grandchildren, William and Mary, created the province of Massachusetts, which absorbed Plymouth entirely. No longer was the colony governed by the Mayflower Compact of 71 years before. A royal governor ruled, but the spirit of independence was far from dead. The seeds of the American Revolution had already been sown.